And I think that, I was a little kid in the 1980s. I was a teenager in the early to mid 90s. I just turned 45, if anyone's trying to do the math. And shame was, in some ways, a parenting tool. Now, it wasn't a parenting tool of my mother, and to the extent that my father was sort of taking my mother's lead and following the instructions for how the kids were going to be brought up, it wasn't one of his tools either. Although I think he was a very loving parent, but he was a much less reflective parent. And so I think that particularly for my mom and her siblings, and my dad and his siblings, shame was kind of part of how they were brought up and taught what was right behavior. So for my mother, and I think also probably for the aunt and uncle whose kids are the cousins that I really grew up with, they tried very hard to eradicate shame from sort of the upbringing. But most of the other aunts and uncles, my cousins, are a lot younger. And so they weren't actively thinking about how to interact with kids. They were just sort of following the scripts that they had. And I have cousins who are older than me, but all of them lived in India. I'm the oldest of the American-born cousins, and one cousin came here as a teenager when he was 14 and I was 12, or 15 and 11 or whatever. But I was the oldest and my dad's siblings are quite a bit younger. My dad, his next sibling who stayed in India is 6 years younger, but everyone else is 8 to 20 years younger than he is. So they were really young adults, and parenting, again, wasn't on their radar, and so they were going with these scripts, and they were scripts about shame. So shame was, I think, actually kind of deliberate in training behavior. But it wasn't necessarily racialized shame. So with the Indian relatives, I think it was, because so often the discipline was about not being Indian enough, things that I didn't know, failing to show respect in the right way. And a good example of this would be in the United States, right? You show respect by making eye contact in the same way that I'm making eye contact with you right now, unless I'm turning to try to make eye contact with people in the audience. And in India, you wouldn't make eye contact, right? That's a brazen behavior. You would look down. And so I would get in trouble for making eye contact, particularly when being dressed down for something else. And, but it wasn't racialized shame, right? At least on my mom's side of the family, the shame that you would get from using your own knife to stick in the butter knife instead of using the butter knife, that would also elicit the same reaction. But yeah, I do think it was deliberate a lot of the time. But again, not necessarily because anyone was aware of it or conscious of it so much as because that was part of how all of these folks who weren't thinking about how they might want to be different than their parents were raising their kids.
Yeah, so it was a kind of a way of correcting or trying to bring you in line with who they thought you should be.
Right. The one kind of counterexample to the argument that I just made, where I sometimes wonder, I still actually think it was about upbringing, but I came downstairs, and I write about this in the book, in a salwar kameez, which is if the sort of Indian dress that you might think of, if you think of, I was going to date myself by saying Indira Gandhi, but if you think of the sort of drapey silk outfit, that's a sari. A salwar kameez is the sort of long tunic with the sort of baggy pants, or sometimes they're really tight pants. That's actually a churidar pajama. But I came downstairs, I actually don't remember whether it was a salwar kameez or a churidar pajama. And my aunt, who was one of the white aunts, said, "So you're super ethnic now?" And I can't imagine that she didn't think that was gonna elicit shame. And I don't know why she did it, right? I was living with her. I know that she was anxious about protecting me from racism in the city that we lived in. Was she worried about what was gonna happen when I walked out of the house? Was she just disconcerted? Again, in really liberal settings, you get a lot of exoticization, right, of the East. And my aunt would be the kind of person who, because of her interactions with my dad's family, would feel uncomfortable about, would know that that was something that maybe one shouldn't do. Was she therefore identifying with me and forgetting that because I'm half Indian, I have a different relationship to Indianness than she would have as a white woman. And even my mom, who like on the one hand is a white woman and on the other hand was a wife in an Indian family for 40 years. So my mom wore Indian clothes all of the time, although interestingly hasn't since she's been widowed. Even with like my dad's family being like, you know, we're right here, you can wear a sari to the wedding, like you're with us, you're good. Right? Like, but like, was my aunt thinking of that? Was my aunt correcting me in the same way that my mother, without my father standing next to her, doesn't wear those outfits anymore? But again, I can't imagine, what on earth did she think I was gonna feel if it wasn't shame?